to introduce Justin Kunimune, who is the lead of the Boston chapter of the Citizens Climate Lobby. And he's also a researcher at the Plasma Science. It used to be PFC, Justin. Now it's
Now it's
Plasma
PSFC.
PSFC at MIT, and has worked in research in fusion energy for a number of years. So we're so happy to have him come and talk to us tonight. In fact, I'm doubly happy because he just finished his Boston chapter meeting and then just came right onto our Zoom. So he's most generous of his time. And Justin, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you. Yeah, so I'm just going to give a broad overview of nuclear fusion energy, the basic science, the current prospects, where we are in the research, and what it could mean for our energy supply. So my goal today is to kind of explain why people are very optimistic about fusion, but also, temper that with the fact that fusion is not a sure thing. And so my thesis is basically nuclear fusion could be a game changer in clean energy, or it might not. The next 10 years, I think, will tell. So, as a overview of my talk, nuclear fusion is the power source of the stars. It's a clean, abundant, dispatchable, and safe energy source. And right now, the two main avenues of research are laser inertial fusion, which uses lasers to compress the fuel, and magnetic fusion, which uses powerful magnets. And both of those have their pros and cons, and both are seeing major progress in their research right now. So, fusion will not solve climate change in the short term just because of where it is with the research, but it may be an important technology in the medium to long term, getting us fully decarbonized and providing energy long term. But it depends on how it competes with other emerging energy technologies. And so I'll touch briefly on that as well. So first of all, just the basics. Like I said, nuclear fusion is the fuel source of the stars. The sun and every other star in the universe contain hot gas that gets compressed by their gravitational field and creates fusion reactions. A fusion reaction is basically any nuclear reaction that involves light nuclei, especially ones that take lighter elements like hydrogen and turn them into heavier elements like helium. So here I'm showing the deuterium-tritium fuel cycle, which is the one that we most commonly explore for generating energy. You start with hydrogen 2 and hydrogen 3, also known as deuterium and tritium. If you collide those two atoms at a high enough speed, then they can fuse and turn into helium-4 and a neutron. That neutron in a fusion reactor will then collide with a lithium atom, and that will cause the lithium to turn into helium-4 and hydrogen-3. And so then you can take that tritium atom and put it back into your reactor to create more fusion reactions. So, so deuterium and lithium are the inputs, and then helium-4 is all that comes out.
Hmm.
And so this is a very this is a pretty simple reaction, but it's a very powerful one in terms of the amount of energy it can potentially release. The way that we do these is we create fusion reactors that use high temperatures to achieve a self-sustaining burn. So the idea here is the same as like burning a conventional fuel like oil, or where you have some fuel and you heat it up. With fossil fuels, you need to heat it up to, a few hundred degrees. With a fusion reactor, you need to heat it up to millions of degrees. So it's a little bit different in that respect. But once the plasma is in this superheated state and you start having fusion reactions, those reactions will release energy, which will then help to keep the plasma hot. And so we describe it as burning because it's the same as a combustion reaction where carbon reacts with oxygen to make CO2 and releases energy that heats up surrounding carbon, which causes more reactions. So it's the same thing, but instead of creating CO2, we're doing nuclear reactions and creating helium.
Hmm.
And so we call this a burning plasma because it's analogous to the way that fire works. As far as an energy source, fusion would fill a niche in our current clean energy supply. So right now, as far as energy sources that do not produce carbon pollution, we basically have four categories. There's wind and solar, hydroelectric, geothermal, and nuclear fission. And all of these uh, are great technologies in my opinion, but they all have significant drawbacks that limits how much we can use them. With wind and solar, they require a lot of land because they're just not very energy dense, and they especially have issues with intermittency. Solar panels don't work at night, and wind turbines don't work when the wind's not blowing. And in addition, they can only generate electricity, which is only about 40% of our current energy consumption. There are other things like industrial processes where you can't use electricity, and so and so currently those mostly use fossil fuels. Um, then there's hydroelectric, also requires a lot of land because you have to build a reservoir. With dams, there's always the risk of accidents, which can be quite destructive as far as infrastructure accidents go. And again, they only generate electricity. Geothermal gets around a lot of these issues, but geothermal currently has very strict siting requirements. For the most part, you can only use it in places that are geologically active, like near volcanoes.
Hmm.
And then there's nuclear fission, which does not have any of the previously stated issues, but it does have a lot of public opposition and very high capital costs that make it difficult to build, largely because of the very strict safety regulations that you have to go through to operate a nuclear fission reactor. And in addition, it's non-renewable. It requires fuel, which you have to dig out of the ground. Uranium is a lot more plentiful than, say, oil, but there's still only a finite amount. And so fusion uh, basically circumvents all of those. You can build it anywhere, you can use it anytime, it can generate industrial heat. It's still non-renewable, but it's so abundant in terms of the amount of fuel that is available that it's like basically infinite, and it's also inherently safe. So I'll talk more about these in detail now. First of all, as far as abundance goes, fusion fuel is abundant and the most potent fuel source known to humans. So,
Hmm.
just to put things in perspective, the amount of energy contained in 12 tons of coal is equivalent to the amount of energy in 90 barrels of gasoline. That's equivalent to 90 grams of uranium, but only 2 grams of fusion fuel. So, you can imagine, 2 grams of hydrogen and lithium is the equivalent of tons and tons of coal that you would have to burn. And so, like I said before, the inputs to the deuterium tritium fuel cycle are hydrogen 2 and lithium. Hydrogen 2 is basically unlimited. It occurs naturally as a component of all hydrogen and can be extracted relatively easily. Lithium is more limited, but compared to other things that we use lithium for, it's the amount of the amount that you need for fusion is very small. So I did the math, and if we wanted to produce all electricity on planet Earth with just fusion reactors, we could do so with only 2% of the lithium that we're currently producing. And there's enough deuterium and lithium currently available to us in the crust and ocean to power the Earth for millions of years. And again, that's if we use fusion for all of our energy needs. Fusion reactors are also inherently safe. The main reason for this is that the high temperatures that you need to get fusion reactions are basically only achievable when the machine is turned on. And so with oil, gas, and nuclear fission, there's always the possibility of an accidental, uncontrolled reaction. That can't happen in fusion because if anything goes wrong and the machine turns off, then the plasma will cool down and dissipate, and the reaction will immediately stop. In addition, because the amount of fuel used is small, the risk of releasing radioactive material is much mitigated compared to fission reactors, which in the past have had problems with releasing
Meeting?
radioactive material
Yes.
into the
Is this going
environment.
on right now? Well, you better here, mute yourself.
Um, and then, as far as byproducts, fusion byproducts are relatively easy to dispose of. Um, so the ash, we call it ash, but it's really helium. The stuff that comes out of the reactions is just helium, which can be released into space. Because helium is lighter than air, you can either sell it because helium actually is worth stuff, but even if you don't want to, if you release it, it'll actually just naturally escape into space. It's a very cool fact about helium. Um, the there are things other than byproducts that you have to dispose of. Namely, the solid components of the reactor are radioactive and must be disposed of accordingly. However, compared to other kinds of radioactive waste like coal ash and spent fission fuel, they naturally become safe after just a few decades. So if you store them on site for a few decades, the radiation just naturally burns itself out, which is very convenient. Yeah, so I'm going to now talk about the details of fusion research. So right now there's two main approaches to fusion research, and those are laser inertial fusion and magnetic fusion. Laser inertial fusion is currently leading in scientific performance, but it struggles with scale compared to other approaches. So this is actually the type of fusion that I worked on during my PhD research. You start with a very small capsule of spherical capsule of fusion fuel. This picture kind of gives an idea of the scale. And what you do is you shoot lasers at it from all directions in order to compress it. And what happens is when you compress it, you go down to like 30th of the original radius, and that causes it to become much denser and hotter, which creates a burning plasma. That plasma is very small, but it's also very dense. So it produces a lot of power, but only for about a billionth of a second at a time. And so um, inertial fusion, yeah, so inertial fusion is, like I said, has better performance than magnetic fusion in terms of the amount of energy you're able to get out for a given amount of energy in. Um, but the but it struggles with scale in terms of scaling up to a power plant. Because currently it takes a few hours for the lasers to cool down and to position the target in front of the lasers. Whereas for a power plant, you'll need to be compressing multiple pellets per second. And so I think the main challenge with inertial fusion is that even though scientifically it's doing very well, there's a lot of engineering challenges associated with taking this 1 to 5 shots per day to multiple shots per second that you'll need for a power plant. That said, um, in terms in terms of actually getting a burning plasma, inertial laser inertial fusion is the only type of fusion that has achieved that so far. So you may have seen in the news in 2021 in Livermore, California, they created the first self-heating plasma in a laboratory ever. So they this plot is basically showing experiments at the National Ignition Facility in Livermore over time, over the past 15 years or so. And you can see that they've very gradually been making progress, making small adjustments to the experiment in order to to compress the plasma and get it to higher temperatures. And finally, in 2021, they were able to get over a megajoule of fuel out of a single capsule. And the reason was that they finally got it hot enough that the heat from fusion reactions was enough to sustain itself, even when the lasers had been turned off. And they've continued to improve since there. So even though there are engineering challenges, there's a lot of people looking at the space of laser inertial fusion because if it continues scaling at this rate, it hopefully won't be too long until the technology is in a place where you can make it into a power plant. Magnetic fusion, on the other hand, scales better, but the research has stagnated in recent decades. So the way this works is plasmas naturally conform to magnetic fields. So you build these powerful electromagnets, like these ones shown in this picture, that generate basically a circular magnetic field. And so that will naturally confine the plasma into a circular area. Once the plasma is there, you can heat it up, and the magnetic fields will prevent it from expanding and cooling as long as the magnets are turned on. And so magnetically confined plasmas are much larger. They don't produce as much, they don't burn as bright just because the density is much lower. But a, a magnetic reactor can maintain a plasma for seconds or minutes at a time. And so, for that reason, I personally think that magnetic fusion is better suited to energy production because we already have these reactors that produce relatively large amounts of power for human timescales. That said, the research has stagnated with magnetic fusion in recent decades. So here's a plot of magnetic fusion experiments and their performance over time. And you can see that tokamaks are the leading type of experiment, but the last major record for tokamaks was set back around 1990. Since then, there's been, like I said, a stagnation in building new machines and getting new results from previous machines. So right now, the best reactor in the world is the Joint European Torus in the UK. It was built back in the 80s, and they've been able to get some improvements out of it through upgrades since then, but not a lot has been built since then. This will hopefully change in the near future, but that's one reason why some people are more interested in laser inertial fusion than magnetic fusion.
Justin,
I'll
could
also,
you, just one quick question. This is Linda.
yes.
Could you tell us what those different colored things are? Stellarator, spherical,
Oh
are they
yeah.
machines or what?
Yeah, it's not too important. There are different types of machine. So, tokamaks were invented in Russia, but they're now built all over the world. And they have the best performance. They generate an electric current in the plasma, which twists the field in a particular way that gives particularly good performance. Stellarators were invented in the US, and they're kind of the second most popular design. They're more complicated to build. They have more complicated electromagnets. But there's been some recent theoretical research showing that they might be able to surpass tokamaks in performance in the near future. And then these are just a lot of other different approaches. I won't go through them all in detail. They're all the same general idea if you use magnetic fields to confine the plasma, but there's different shapes and arrangements. So I'll briefly mention that there are also other more advanced reactor concepts in addition to magnetic and laser-based ones. For example, there's pulsed magnetic fusion, like they're doing at Helion, if you've heard of them. There's electrostatic fusion, where you use electric fields to hold the particles in place. There's projectile fusion, where they just shoot the fuel at a target at extremely high speeds. None of these designs have really shown good results in the past, so personally, I think it's very unlikely that any of these will come to fruition in the next 50 years, but there are a lot of companies looking at these alternative avenues. Um, yeah, and so many different fusion energy projects are in progress right now. Here I'm just showing some of the more important ones. I'm not going to talk in detail about all of them, but just to give you an idea, the US is kind of leading right now, but Europe has historically had a strong fusion program, and they're also building various new reactors. And then China is also currently investing a lot of money in this to try to bring their fusion program up to speed. But you'll note that one of these, Spark, is actually in Massachusetts. And as it happens, this is actually kind of the leading fusion energy project right now. It's at the former site of Fort Devens in Harvard, Massachusetts. It's being built by the company Commonwealth Fusion Systems, and it's currently expected to be the first burning plasma in a magnetic fusion reactor in history. So the kind of the idea behind Commonwealth Fusion Systems, they were founded back in 2017. They basically looked at the status of magnetic fusion research and said, no one's built any, no one's made any breakthroughs in magnetic fusion in the last 20, 30 years. But there's new superconductor technology that we think we can apply to our existing tokamaks, which would actually get us over the threshold from these experiments that don't really produce any energy to actually breaking even, producing more power than you put in, and actually getting a significant amount of burn in your plasma. And so uh, that reactor, it'll, and multiple other companies have since also taken on this idea, but Commonwealth was kind of the first, and so they're the furthest ahead. This new reactor is called Spark. They're hoping to finish it in the next few years. It won't itself be a power plant, it's more of a demonstration reactor. But once they have that built, and assuming that it does what they expect, they're hoping to then take that same technology and turn it into a power plant, and they're targeting sometime in the 2030s for that. So, of course, the question everyone always wants to know is how quickly can fusion be deployed? Most companies, I would say, that have a realistic estimate are currently predicting a first fusion power plant sometime in the 2030s. There are a few like Helion. Helion is saying they're going to have a power plant in 2028. I really don't think that's going to happen. They've barely started building it, and it kind of takes longer than 3 years to build a power plant. Other companies don't have a timeline yet because they're further behind and might be making power plants in the 2040s or 50s. But I think that 2030s is a reasonably likely timeline that they might hit. Um, if fusion scales as fast as fission did when we first invented fission reactors, it'll take around 20 more years from the first power plant to actually building a significant number of them. That might be a little bit optimistic, but that's basically how quickly fission scaled, and that's the closest analog we have. And so, if you do the math, basically what that means is fusion will not solve climate change before 2050, which is something that I think many people are hoping that a technology like fusion will come in and get us to net zero by 2050. I think it's just not in the cards with where we currently are. But that said, I don't want to imply that fusion is unimportant or that it won't help, because I think there are multiple considerations that will make it important in the mid to long term. For one thing, even though we sometimes talk about 2050 as the year that we're going to reach net zero, at the rate we're going, it'll probably take longer than that to achieve decarbonization. So, depending on where we are when we start building all these fusion power plants, there might still be a large unmet need for firm, clean energy at that time that fusion will be able to fill. Especially considering that we have increasing energy demand, especially with data centers that are popping up, and also just the electrification of places like Africa and Asia, where they have growing populations and not very and pretty dirty electrical grids. Um, and then the one other thing I want to note is the limited amount of fuel for nuclear fission. So, like I said, nuclear fission is the only non-polluting power source we have right now that requires fuel. And while we have a decent amount of uranium, it may run out in the next, 300 years or so, which is a pretty long time horizon as far as energy related problems usually go. But that's one other reason why, even if we have a bunch of nuclear fission power plants, fusion will be a better way to go long term because the fuel is practically unlimited. Yeah, and then one other thing I want to note is that fusion still has to compete against other emerging clean energy technologies if it wants to be the one to save the day as far as climate change goes. Because there are a lot of other technologies that are trying to fill these unmet needs in our power supply. Generation 4 fission reactors are kind of similar. They have a lot of the same advantages that fusion reactors do. And then there's also small modular fission reactors that are hopefully going to be cheaper and easier to build than existing nuclear fission reactors. Both of these have been in research for a while, but we don't have any in the US. But I think China has actually built a couple of both of these. There's also advanced geothermal. They're trying to reapply some technology from the oil and gas industry to make geothermal energy something that can be built anywhere, not just in areas with volcanoes. And that they're actually doing pretty well. They already have 3 megawatts on the grid, a pretty small amount, but bigger than zero, which is more than can be said for us in the fusion business. And then, of course, there's also utility scale batteries, which can couple with wind and solar to ease the intermittency issues. And so, while batteries are still an emerging technology, there have been quite a few of them built already. There's 20 gigawatts of them on the grid. So we'll see how that plays out. The wind and solar still have the large land use requirement, and they still can't do industrial heat. But that, I think, the biggest problem with wind and solar right now is the fact that they don't work all the time, and so batteries will really help them fill in that issue. Um, yeah, and so that's kind of everything I wanted to talk about. As I said, the overall message I want you to come away with is that nuclear fusion could be a game changer in clean energy, but it also might not be. And I think in the next 10 years, when we have some of these new reactors coming online and hopefully even power plants, I think that's when we'll start to know for sure how big a deal fusion is going to be. So, just to recap, fusion is the power source of the stars. It's clean, abundant, dispatchable, and safe. And the two main avenues of research right now are inertial fusion and magnetic fusion. There are other approaches as well, like pulsed schemes and projectile fusion, but I think laser and magnetic are the only ones we really need to be paying attention to. It will not solve climate change by 2050, but it may be a very important power supply in the medium to long term. And that depends on how it competes with other emerging technologies like batteries and advanced geothermal. So yeah, thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Justin. That's more than I've ever known about fusion. And I see that Steve Wenner has his hand up. So Steve, you want to ask a question?
Sure, Justin, a little technical question here. I've read that fusion requires a small amount of tritium, and that's a problem because the only source of tritium is the waste product of fusion reactions. Do you see that as a problem, or do I have that wrong?
It's a challenge, but it's something that everyone in the fusion business is taking steps to deal with. The current idea is that the core of the fusion reactor, where you have the plasma, it will be surrounded by a blanket of a liquid salt containing lithium. And so you need to have something around the reactor anyway to catch the neutrons and turn them into energy. And so it's actually pretty convenient to just mix lithium in there so that those neutrons hit the lithium, which simultaneously deposits their energy and also generates tritium that you can then put back into the reactor. So the idea is you'll use lithium as one of the inputs, and then you can create a more or less self-sufficient supply of tritium.
Maybe, thank you very much. I understand much better. Um, Maybe a more basic, lower level question. If wind and solar with batteries um, can generate all the electricity we need, um, and maybe indirectly provide some of the thermal heat energy that we need, um, why do we need fusion?
Yeah, I think that's a fair question especially recently with the way that batteries have started to take off. And I think the answer is it might make it so that we don't need fusion, but I think it's too early to say, just because it still has drawbacks that fusion does not, namely the fact that you still need a lot of land for the wind turbines and solar panels, and also just the fact that it is quite difficult to do industrial heating, and then also like powering maritime transport, which is something that maybe fusion won't be able to do either, but there are companies looking at trying to have fusion reactor powered ships, which is something you can't really do with wind or solar. So,
Yeah, I was reading that today that um, green ammonia might be a good fuel for marine transport rather than bunker fuel.
mhm.
Um, so that there do seem to be solutions to um, that can provide fuels for some of these more difficult to electrify technologies like aircraft and large ships and so forth,
Yeah.
uh, by
Yeah, I think
converting wind and solar and batteries into some other kind of very dense type of fuel like ammonia.
I think there absolutely are other solutions, and at the rate things are going, they may bear fruit. Um, but my general take is that I think it's good to have as many solutions available to us as possible. And so fusion is a very powerful lever if we can make it work. And I think it'll hopefully turn out to be useful. But like I said, it's competing at this point with batteries for sure.
Hmm.
Maybe I shouldn't
Uh,
say competing. I want everyone to succeed. If any of them succeed, that's good for me. But I suppose in terms of my job prospects, maybe.
Linda, I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Justin, what do you think is the reason the fusion uh, was not developed as earlier as before, earlier than now? What is political opposition to that?
Yeah, I would say it's a variety of things. I mean, fusion, they really started research into fusion energy back in the 50s. And I think from the 50s to the through the 60s and 70s, they were pretty far from having a reactor, but they were making rapid progress. And then when in the 90s, progress really started to stall, and that's when I think we developed a lot of the cultural pessimism about nuclear fusion. And part of that was just that um, a lot of the technology wasn't there. Like these current companies, a lot of them are using new high temperature superconductor technology that was only invented around 2010 or so. And part of it was also a matter of funding. In I think around 1990, all the governments in the world that had fusion programs kind of got together and said, okay, these reactors don't work, but if we make it really, really big, then it will work. And so they started building ITER, which is this humongous, like 8-story fusion reactor in southern France.
Hmm.
And while I think that ITER is a great project for like international collaboration and will give us very useful physics when it gets turned on, it's also like 20 years behind schedule because it's just so huge and each part is made in a different country. So it's really, I would say, slowed down fusion research by sucking in all this funding into a project that many would argue is quite inefficient in terms of actually advancing the science.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Justin, could you unshare the slides so that we can see you?
Yes.
And oh, excellent. Well, that's really helpful to hear that it sounds like that there have been in the past 10 or 20 years some changes that have made fusion more likely to be attainable. Is that a fair sort of,
Yeah,
since I didn't
absolutely.
follow everything? Because sometimes I think, well, we're spending a huge amount of money. I don't know how much money has gone into fusion, but I'm guessing that to do this kind of work is quite expensive.
Yeah.
Um,
Although one
yeah.
of the big changes that I didn't mention is that most of the funding is now coming from the private sector rather than the public sector.
Hmm,
And so that's one
interesting.
reason why Fusion has a lot more funding going into it now, is because investors have really taken interest in it.
Mhm, mhm. Hmm. And with respect to the, I have a question about what is advanced geothermal? Because I know there's like this geothermal installation in Framingham that's gotten so
Yeah, it's
much
separate
news.
from that.
It's not the same beast.
Yeah, there's like two different emerging geothermal technologies. There's the networked heating system like they have in Framingham. That doesn't generate energy, it's just a way to heat homes more efficiently. Then
Hmm.
advanced geothermal is so previously, geothermal energy, if you want to get energy, you have to go to a place where there are hot rocks that are accessible, places where there's geysers or volcanoes.
Hmm.
Um, but with
Ah,
advanced geothermal, it's actually the same technology they use in fracking, where you drill these wells deep underground and then create um, these horizontal shafts that you can pump water through. So with fracking, usually what they're doing is they're um, pumping in water to extract gas that's trapped in the cracks in the rock. With geothermal, they're pumping in water and then just sucking the water back out. But they're able to access these very deep areas where the rock is quite high temperature, and so the heated water makes it back to the surface and then spins a turbine, and that allows them to get energy
I
from
see.
places where it was inaccessible before.
I see. So it's geothermal, the same word used in extremely different applications. One is to
Yeah,
get it hot enough to run a steam turbine, and the other one is to just get enough heat from the uh, underneath, 5, 10, however feet below ground
yeah,
to heat water for a heat pump. Okay. Wow. This is sort of um, challenging to understand, but it's really helpful because we hear so much about it and it's not clear to me, you know, I'm glad to hear that it's making progress and appearing to have traction, but it does seem like it's a long
yeah.
ways from scale. So, okay. More thoughts, questions? Dick? You have your hand up, Dick? Dick, I
Dick,
think you're
you're
muted.
muted.
Let's try that.
There
I
you go.
graduated from undergraduate school about almost 70 years ago, so I've been watching this for a long time. And for many, many years, the estimates were all, it's only 30 years till we're going to produce power out of this. And now it's coming down to your number is something like 10. How optimistic do you think that is?
Um, I mean, I think I think most of the current timelines will probably are in fact optimistic and will probably be pushed back. But I do think we're at the point where a fusion power plant will happen in the next 10 or 20 years. Like we understand the science a lot better than now than we did at any point in history. And we have new technological breakthroughs, mostly these superconducting magnets that really have put that within reach. It's just a matter of building the machines that incorporate this new technology. So, so like, and it does vary from company to company because there's a lot of different companies pursuing this. Helion, I think, is kind of crazy. They say they're going to have power by 2028. Commonwealth says they're going to have a power plant in the 2030s. And I would say that I think that's probably going to happen. It'll probably be toward the later end of the 2030s, close to 2040, but I think they're on a good track to do that. And I think that the science is in a place where we can feel reasonably confident that we know how these things scale.
So Justin, it seems like, I'm thinking about having multiple private companies trying to build this versus having government money that would be a bigger pot of money and more focused. Do you think the business model of having for-profit companies working on this is really efficient or?
I think I think that the private funding model by itself is pretty good, mostly because it's injected a lot of money into fusion where the government has not really wanted to spend money on it for a while now.
Hmm.
I will say there is the main disadvantage of what the current ecosystem we have is that there's like 50 companies and many of them are researching very similar things and don't want to share notes with each other because they're trying to compete. And so I think that has been a challenge for the fusion industry. And there are ways that people are trying to, encourage them to share information or encouraging them to subcontract tasks that are very similar to third parties that can kind of specialize and serve the rest of the field. But overall, I would say that with the discovery of these new superconductors and the new results at the National Ignition Facility, which really led to this shift from public funding to private funding, I think we're in a much better place now, just because the amount of money is actually much larger.
It's steady, probably.
Hopefully, this current status
Yeah,
quo has only been this way for like 5 years, so we'll see, depending on what the economy does in the next few years.
Right.
But
and
hopefully,
executive orders.
yeah.
Uh,
I don't think our government is against this. form of
Yeah,
energy? Is
so
it currently, this is not one of the ones they're trying to drown in the bathtub?
I think one of the advantages in that regard is that, like I said, the US is leading in fusion research, and it kind of seems like the current administration doesn't like anything that China is good at. But if we're good at it and China's not very good at it, then it's American. So that means it's good.
But I still don't understand why private industry is ahead of the public industry. If the uh, if the government understand this science, then why did not involve them? Especially because now they are closing in the United States. They're closing the fusion uh, energy. Why don't they uh, um, stimulate the private industry in research in their research?
Yeah, well, I would say even though the government does like fusion, at least the current administration also does not like spending money on research. So we haven't seen nearly as many cuts as most areas of public funding have, but we also haven't seen big gains. And I think that's been true for the last few decades. Like there has been continuous support from the government. It just hasn't been at very high levels of funding. And part of that is because a lot of money is still going to ITER, the international collaboration in France. But I think part of it is also just that it's hard. The government doesn't like to spend a lot of money on any particular thing. When it comes to more long-term research like this, they usually prefer to give continuous but smaller amounts to help the research progress to to the point where it becomes profitable or the private sector takes interest.
Mhm.
And the private sector has just really been putting a lot of money into fusion recently. So even though the government hasn't been decreasing their amount, they have actually been issuing some new grants. The private industry, I think in 2021, they dropped $2 billion into Commonwealth fusion systems. And since then, they've just continued to ramp up their contributions every year. It turns out rich people just have a lot of money and they love
Yes.
throwing it at stuff that might be cool. Especially now because fusion kind of ties into AI because you can use fusion to power your data centers. So
My
they love
gosh.
that.
They probably want it on Mars too. So I'm going to ask for any last questions. Oh, Jerry, I see you have your hand up. Jerry, go
Yeah.
ahead.
Thanks. You know, and thanks for the cold water realism about the future. I mean, for the last 50 years, I've heard it's going to be active in 10 or 15 years. So now we have maybe a better assessment. I think the government support for innovative industry, it tends to be spin-offs from warfare.
That's
A lot
true.
of, you know, we can, if we're going to kill people en masse, then we can throw a lot of money at it. We don't have to feed people or fix any problems. But if we can kill people, then we can develop a new technology, and then then the private industry said, I'm surprised that with the horizon of 20 to 30 years for payout, you know, that's a long time for an investor. I mean, they're usually looking for, you know, getting their money back in a year or two. So,
Yeah, I think most of the funding has been coming from individuals who have a lot of money and want to bet it on a longer term, something longer term. Like, I don't think we're getting a lot from like hedge funds or anything like that. But like, Bill Gates has put a lot of money into fusion. Sam Altman is like the chair of the board of directors of Helion. So that's the kind of archetype that I think is currently fueling the fusion funding.
Hmm. Well,
But yeah, that's absolutely true about military applications. There, because some types of fusion research are actually also applicable to military research. And so the National Ignition Facility, the leading laser inertial experiment in the world, is primarily funded by the National Nuclear Security Administration to study nuclear weapons. Um, and it's nice that it also has applications to energy, but that's not really why the government cares about it.